think of some of the issues, just some of the issues that disturb us about the present state of the culture in which we are living. Think of some of the more common ones that offend and trouble us. For some of us, it might be the abuses of the use of alcohol in our society, or the growing spread and use of narcotics, such as a new over-the-counter drug I heard about this week that is available for anybody to buy, but which youth are using in epidemic proportions inappropriately to get new highs. For one lady who wrote to her pastor a scathing letter about his silence, it would have been the abuses of the out-of-control members of the military and the poor decision-making about appropriate military involvement around the world. For some, it is the epidemic disintegration of the family, and especially due particularly to the failure of fathers to lead their spouses and children in healthy ways and in the pursuit of God. For some of us with pretty sensitive consciences, it's also easy to become frustrated by some of the messages that are being sent out over the TV and over the internet. To quote one columnist, once the chorus of cultural values was full of ministers, teachers, and neighbors, and leaders. Now the messengers are violent cartoon characters, rappers, and celebrities selling sneakers. I even have to confess to you that in recent times, more than once, ask Susan, more than once, I have reacted angrily to things I have heard on TV. Now, probably I should have turned it off, but I did react angrily to things I was hearing. There are many trends in the culture that can disturb our hearts, can't they? And especially if our heart is sensitive to a holy God who has high moral standards, who cares about us and desires to see us walk in the right ways, which will be constructive to us and to our culture. There's much in our culture that can disturb us easily these days, isn't there? But the larger question then that ought to come to our mind has to do with what then can we do about it? What can any of us, given our limitations, and what can we do that will make a difference? Even together, we're a pretty small church family. Can we make any kind of a difference against the negative developments spreading throughout our culture? Or say like in Olympia tomorrow? Can we even make a dent against the spread of evil? Or are we just left with coming to a point where we wring our hands and accept the fact that it's hopeless to think our society can be changed and give up any hope that we can do anything about it that will matter? And even if we do have the heart for doing something about it, as some of us still do, it does seem that we can end up agreeing with Addison Leach when he says it's harder to see in our contemporary scene just what it is the church is called upon to do against the culture. Is there anything that will help? Well, let's go back to the words of Jesus we just read. They are taken from the Sermon on the Mount, but these are words in which I think we find Jesus' plan for how his followers, how you and I, can actually make a difference in our culture. Matthew 5, verses 13 through 16, words which I think he really did intend to guide his followers to shaping the culture in which they live. So how does Jesus think this can work with you and I, with us, with his followers? Well, let's look at the plan he sets out in these verses. And the first observation we want to make about his words here then is how he tells us that as his followers, we have been put on display in the world. Yeah, already we have been set apart by God and put on display in the world. It is true that at times we may feel that nobody really gives us any attention. At times, we may get discouraged by the fact that the people we most wish would notice us are really ignoring us. But what Jesus wants you and I to hear and understand this morning is that we are still on display. Even if we think there's nothing about us worthy to be seen, Jesus has put us out on display in the world once He saved us and put the Holy Spirit within us. People are watching us. Often, people of whom we are totally oblivious. The metaphor Jesus uses to describe this to His listeners in these words is found in verse 14. It is that of a city set on a hill. A possible allusion maybe to the city of Sapphit, not very far from where Jesus was teaching, which sits upon a very eminent and conspicuous mountain and would have been in the eyes of His listeners. Or it could have been a reference to Jerusalem, known as being set on Mount Zion, and often poetically described as on display for the whole country to see. But it really doesn't matter which city here. The point that Jesus is making is that we, you and I, His followers, have been positioned in the world, whether we see it or feel it or not. We have been positioned in the world in the same way by a God who called us to Himself and saved us, just like cities set on a hill that cannot be hidden. Or if you want a different picture of this, there's a picture in verse 15 that Jesus uses of how we, His followers, are like lights not meant to be hidden. As He describes it, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket. Now the reference here is to a projecting stone that comes out from the wall in a smaller house on which the lamp is set. For many houses in that day, that was the only light. It was set on a projecting stone so that it could shine upon everyone and everything inside the house. So, says Jesus, God has done that to those of us who have been saved and become His followers. He has lit a light in each of us by His Holy Spirit and then placed us, as it were, on the lampstand so as to give light to all who are in the house, meaning everyone near and around us, even those people who are watching us that we are totally oblivious to. In the Old Testament, of course, that was Israel's role. A role that many prophets, including Isaiah, had to continually remind the people to live up to. As Isaiah tells them in one place, Isaiah 60, verses 2 and 3, "For behold, darkness will cover the earth, and deep darkness the peoples. But the Lord will rise upon you, and His glory will appear upon you. Nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising." But now what Jesus is saying to His followers in these words is that we now have that chosen role in the world. According to John 8:12, He has even given us His light to glow through us, telling us that he who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. This is why Paul could tell the Thessalonian church in 1 Thessalonians 5:5, "For you are all sons of light and sons of the day. We are not night nor darkness." Or you could tell the Ephesians church in Ephesians 5:8, "For you were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord." Do you see that this morning? We have been put on display. We are being noticed, and even if sometimes we try to crawl under the shelf so that people will not notice us. To quote W.H. Griffith Thomas in his sermon, Knowing and Showing, "There are people in the world around us who never open, who never read this book, the Bible, but they are reading us. Are they able to see God in our lives? Are they able to say of us to others, that man or that woman reminds me so much of Christ?" That's Jesus' plan. That is a key part of His plan to influence people around us. That is a key part of His plan to help us steer the culture in the right direction. Do you see that in Jesus' plan, we are His tools to influence the culture? And He has already put us on display in the world. We are there. But you might wonder then, but okay, I get that, but how does that even change anything? So God puts us on display in front of the world. How does that even change a bit that's going on? In doing that, how does He affect others? How does He affect the culture through us? Well, this also Jesus tells us here. Because He also reminds us here that we as His followers, we as the ones who are on display in the world, we do have a very specific role to play in His plan. One way to look at it, Jesus says, is to see ourselves as salt, or as taste inducers, you might say. Meaning that we are ones who are supposed to live in such a way as to make the people around us increasingly thirsty for Jesus. In verse 13, Jesus uses the metaphor of salt, telling we, His followers, you are the salt of the earth. I have designed you to be the flavoring agent in the spheres in which you walk. I have designed you to be influencers to preserve the world from going bad. I have designed you by your involvement to help keep the world from moral corruption. Maybe we can think of it this way, though, too. Have you ever eaten a pretzel? I used to be addicted to pretzels. Have you ever eaten a pretzel? And have you noticed that for many of us, and I count myself among those, that all we have to do is pick up one of those things and we're hooked and we can't put the bag down? Do you know why? The main reason, of course, is the salt in it. The salt in the pretzel creates a desire for more pretzels. But that's what Jesus is talking about with us. He is talking about you and I living each day in such a way that people become more and more hungry for the life of Jesus Christ they are seeing within us. Maybe kind of like what happened to Joe and his son Jared. Jared had been very intrigued with the idea of God, but he was unable to get any answers from his dad, who was not a believer. One day, however, they both pulled into a car wash sponsored by a local church. When Joe asked how much it would be to get his car washed, one of the leaders of the church says, "It's free, no strings attached. We just want to show you God's love in a practical way." "Are you guys Christians?" Joe asked. "The kind of Christians who believe in God?" And the leader said, "Yes, we are that kind of Christians." And so it was, from that free act of kindness, Joe began to explore that church's God, and Joe eventually became saved, and so did his son. It started with creating a taste through a free act of kindness. Or, says Jesus, we can look at it as being light. As being those who, through the way we live each day, enlighten the world to the beauty and truth of Christ that they see within us. To use Jesus' words, verse 14, you are the light of the world. We are the very instruments God has chosen to open the eyes of men. We are the very instruments God has chosen to spread the light of His truth throughout the world. We are the very instruments God has chosen to be in an immoral world, which sun is in a dark world, by our words and by our example, demonstrating what is the way of true peace, what is the way of true hope, what is the way of true love, what is the way that leads to forgiveness and the hope of salvation in heaven and an eternity with God. An example of this might be the situation that developed in the Soviet Union about 40 years ago. A former detainee wrote about his life in Soviet prison during those days. And he said that among the general despair, while prisoners like